Welcome to Fix It Home Improvement, covering projects that every homeowner should know and great products for home and garden.
Hi, I'm JC, and this is where we share weekly home improvement tips. I'm here with my co-host, Cindy.
Hello, JC.
Hi, Cindy. This week, we're going to talk about composting, and we'd like to thank a listener from Canada for giving us a 5-star rating and review on Apple Podcasts. They didn't leave a name, and we're waiting for book 7 to get back from the editor. It's going to have some great chapters. 1 is a toilet buying guide and what to look for with these new high-efficiency toilets. And there's other cool chapters, too. Ancient Egyptians created compost for growing crops, and they recognized that earthworms helped in the process. So Cleopatra declared them to be sacred, and removal of earthworms from Egypt could be punishable by death. A study done in 1949 by the USDA found that the great fertility of the Nile Valley was primarily because of earthworms, and Fang Sheng Qi Shu in ancient China was writing about compost. Pliny the Elder, around 20 AD, wrote about Romans creating compost for their gardens to improve their crops. The Native American Indians showed pilgrims how to create compost and fertilizer from food and plant scraps. George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, and James Madison were all composters.
What is compost?
So it's decomposed organic matter. It's taking something that was alive, like plants, animals, and insects, and allowing earthworms, bacteria, fungi, other microorganisms, and insects to eat this material, and it turns into this dark, crumbly substance that can be used as an excellent soil amendment or mulch, and it provides nutrients for earthworms, microorganisms in the soil, and your plants. By adding compost to your garden, landscape areas, and lawn, you're going to have healthier soil and healthier plants. Compost contains nutrients and micronutrients that you don't get in most fertilizers, but the main benefit of compost is what it does to the soil structure and the health of the microorganisms that are breaking down nutrients for your plants. By adding compost to your soil, it's going to keep earthworms healthy and multiplying, and earthworms help keep the soil aerated and full of nutrients. As earthworms feed on compost, the nitrogen and other nutrients in their waste is absorbed by the plants. By adding compost to clay or hard-packed soil, it loosens it up. It'll allow more air and moisture to flow through. It frees up your plant's roots. And in sandy soil, it's going to help it hold more nutrients and water close to your plant's roots. If you're starting a new garden and you want to improve the soil, you can take 3 to 4 inches of compost on top of your soil and then dig it down about 6 inches. 12 inches is better.
What do you mean, dig it down?
So use a shovel and dig down, or you can use a tiller and
So you're mixing it?
Yes, mix the compost into your soil. 6 inches minimum. And
dig it down.
And this is going to increase your airflow, water flow, drainage. It's going to be healthier for the plant's roots. And then every year, you just have to add 2 or 3 inches of compost on top of the soil, like a mulch. You don't have to dig it down anymore. And this is going to help control evaporation, the soil temperature. It's going to reduce the amount of water you need, and it provides nutrients for not only your garden, but all the living things in the soil that help break down these nutrients.
So it's like magical.
It is pretty amazing. If you were to look at the pile when you first started, you can tell all the different things that are in it. And then after a couple of months, just from these microorganisms eating this, it turns into this substance that kind of looks like a potting soil, and you would never be able to tell what it originally came from.
Why are you so excited about this?
It is because it is magical. When you're adding compost to an area every year, it's going to reduce or even eliminate the need for extra fertilizers. And you can test the soil every couple of years as you're adding compost to see what nutrients are available for your plants and what's needed rather than guessing. And in most cases, too much fertilizer is worse for your plants than not enough. There's a couple top-rated soil test kits. Soil Savvy, it's soil, and then Savvy is SAVVY, and Lawn Serve, and Serve is SERV. Or you can contact your local university extension, and they have soil tests.
Cool.
I spoke to LawnServe about adding compost to your lawn, and they recommended never adding more than about a half an inch of compost on top of your lawn because you can damage the grass. And they said to rake it in well so the leaves aren't covered. And they said the best time to add compost is when you're core aerating your lawn.
So this is when you're pulling out plugs from your lawn?
Right. And they said rake up the plugs, add about a half an inch of compost onto your lawn, and then rake it in well. And this is going to get the compost down into those holes in your soil. It's going to help your lawn retain more water. You're going to have better soil and a healthier lawn. And LawnServe is that company that has a lawn care subscription program.
Right.
The University of Illinois Extension says compost helps control plant diseases and insects that damage plants, and compost added to soil increases the microorganisms that eat manure, pesticides, and other harmful compounds, preventing them from getting into groundwater and becoming pollutants. Depending on your household, yard and food waste can be 25 to 50% of what you throw away.
Wow.
And the EPA estimates about a quarter of all waste in landfills could have been composted. And one of the problems with not composting yard and food waste is the methane produced when it goes to the landfill. It's not decomposing very fast because of the conditions. They're trying to keep the moisture content around 25% to help protect groundwater. If you have a healthy backyard compost pile, you want the moisture level around 65%.
Wow.
And when they're stacking the waste, they're reducing the amount of oxygen available, so you only have microorganisms that can survive in an anaerobic environment, and they're working much slower than aerobic microorganisms.
What's the problem with methane?
One study I read said landfills account for about 25% of human-generated methane emissions in North America. So methane is trapping heat in the atmosphere. It's contributing to global warming. The Union of Concerned Scientists say the average global sea level has increased about 8 inches since 1880.
Wow.
And they're saying wildfires, hurricanes, rainfall, and flooding is going to increase with global warming depending on your location. They recommend backyard composting, and if you manage a backyard aerobic compost pile properly, it will produce very little or no methane gas. I read an article that said that anaerobic decomposition is so slow in landfills that it takes about 15 years for yard and vegetable waste to decay, and newspapers can still be read after 25 years.
That's crazy.
In a well-balanced and maintained backyard compost pile, in 3 to 6 months, you could have compost that's completely broken down and nothing would be recognizable. Many states are starting to develop their own composting facilities for roadkill rather than transporting the animals to landfills. Virginia is now taking thousands of deer and other large animals that get hit by cars every year to a composting facility. They cover them with sawdust and they spray them with a liquid with microbes in it, and this allows them to decompose. And the decomposition raises the temperature of this pile to around 150 degrees Fahrenheit, and it kills pathogens and other disease-causing microorganisms. And they're saying in 2 to 4 months, they have a compost that they can now use for landscape areas along the highways. So Virginia was spending around $4 million to dispose of roadkill. And this new program, they say, is dramatically lowering the amount of money they spend, and they don't have to buy all of this compost for their landscape areas. So I guess there's a lot of other states that are doing this now.
That's good.
If you're going to start composting and plan on starting a garden, lay out the location of both at the same time. Many gardeners recommend a compost pile that's 3 foot by 3 foot and 3 foot high.
Wow.
And no larger than 5 foot by 5 foot and 5 feet high. They say it's better to have multiple 3 foot by 3 foot piles rather than one that's too large, because you need to be mixing the material regularly for it to decompose fast and without odor.
What are you mixing it with?
So you're just mixing it like with a pitchfork or a shovel. So a pile that's 3 foot by 3 foot by 3 foot is big enough to create the heat needed for fast-working bacteria. If it's too big or too small, it'll slow the process down. But you should check with your local village. You may have restrictions in your community for the location of your compost pile.
So you can't have it in your front lawn?
Right, yeah. They usually want on the side or the back of the house. And you may have to have it set back a certain distance from your lot lines. If you have a lot of leaves every fall and you usually bag your grass clippings, you may want to have multiple piles and a larger area. If you don't have a lot of yard waste, a smaller compost bin or a compost tumbler might be easier and less noticeable. I've seen some compost tumblers with wheels, so you can move it around. And you can build a frame for your compost pile with concrete blocks, landscape timber, or bricks. Some people use 4 pallets, 1 on the bottom with wire mesh on it for airflow, and then 3 as the sides with the front open. You can create a bin with redwood or cedar posts for the corners and use slats on the back and sides with the front open, or you can have removable slats in front so it's more decorative. And you should leave space between the slats for airflow and don't use any treated lumber. There's wire mesh bins you can get and a variety of plastic bins you can buy online or at garden centers. You should also be thinking about where you're going to be staging your food scraps for your pile. There are compost pails you can get with lids to store your kitchen scraps during the day, and that way you can walk them out to the pile when it's convenient. My grandma in Nebraska, she had a small metal pail that she filled with scraps while she was preparing meals, and then she had a 5-gallon bucket off to the side of the steps outside where she'd dump them. And then every couple days she'd take that 5-gallon bucket and put it into her compost pile when she was working in the garden. I read a couple articles about the science of composting by some compost scientists. And it's pretty amazing the different types of bacteria and organisms that are working together to break down this organic material. There's a group of microbes that start breaking down material at temperatures of 55 to 70 degrees. And as they eat and break down this matter, the temperature starts to rise. From 70 to 100 degrees, another group of bacteria start working and the temperature of the pile increases. Around 113 degrees Fahrenheit, this third group of bacteria take over, and then the pile can reach temperatures of 130 to 160 degrees Fahrenheit.
Wow.
Amazing, huh? And they usually sustain this temperature for around 5 days. It kills off disease-causing organisms and weed seeds. Then the pile is going to need extra material and more oxygen by turning it over and mixing it. Along with the 3 main types of bacteria, there are all kinds of other microorganisms and insects that thrive in this organic material, breaking it down. The key things that affect how fast and effective your pile decomposes is a balance of food, air, and water for the organisms. Everything you're putting into this pile will have a ratio of carbon and nitrogen that the organisms are using for food. So a carbon-nitrogen ratio of 25 or 30 to 1 is the best for the fastest decomposition. If you have too much nitrogen or a lack of oxygen, the pile will start to smell. And if you have too much carbon, the decomposition will slow down.
Interesting.
If you only have specific lawn and food waste that you're going to be using in your pile all year long, you can go online and get the carbon-nitrogen ratio of each item. And then you can create a list to get a good balance of how much of each item you should be using. But for most people, the U.S. Composting Council says a good rule of thumb for a compost pile is use 1 part nitrogen, or they call it green stuff, like grass clippings, pruned leaves from plants, scraps from fruits and vegetables, eggshells, coffee grounds, tea bags, feathers, or hair, and 3 parts carbon, or they call it brown stuff, like dead, dry leaves, bark, straw, wood chips, sawdust, the cardboard from paper towels and toilet paper, shredded newspaper, corn stalks, or shredded cardboard. And one scientist said if it's fresh and moist, it's usually high in nitrogen. If it's dry and old, it's high in carbon. You don't want to add egg yolk, meat, oils or grease, pet waste, rice, cheese, fish, chicken, bones, or bread, because it can attract pests. And you don't want to use wood or coal ash because it can be acidic or have chemicals in it. No sawdust from treated lumber or any wood that's been painted or stained. You don't want to put large branches in your pile. You want small, shredded brown material that microbes can break down easier. No coated, printed paper or greeting cards. Walnuts contain a chemical toxic to plants. It's interesting, isn't it?
Mm-hmm.
No clothing because it could have chemicals or dyes that you don't want in your soil. No pizza boxes because of the grease and chemicals in the pizza boxes. You don't want anything that isn't organic in your pile. Also, you don't want to put diseased plants into your pile. I spoke to the Burpee Seed Company, and they mentioned not to use grass clippings if you're using weed and feed or other herbicides on your lawn.
Oh,
And you wouldn't even, it's funny, I didn't even think about it. Or put any weeds that you've treated with chemicals into your pile. They said grass clippings are fantastic,
Right.
but just not if you're using herbicides or even insect control on your lawn. Along with the right mix of nitrogen and carbon in your compost pile, you need to keep it moist. Gardeners say it should be damp but not wet, and you can create an indentation on the top of the pile, spray it with a hose, and the water will work its way down through your pile. If you're in a rainy area, you may need to throw a tarp over the top from time to time to control the moisture. If it's too wet, you can add more shredded newspaper or dry leaves, because if it's too wet, it'll start to smell. If it's too dry, it will slow down the decomposition. And an agricultural scientist said once the material starts to break down, it should feel like a damp sponge if you squeeze it.
Why would you squeeze it?
To see if it feels like a damp sponge. Many gardeners recommend using a shovel or a pitchfork to turn over the compost to increase oxygen and mix up the material and microbes about once a week. And a tumbling composter makes this a lot easier if you plan on getting a bin.
Because who owns a pitchfork?
People who compost. A well-maintained compost pile can shrink 50 to 70%.
Wow.
And a pile 3 foot by 3 foot or 4 foot by 4 foot should be ready to use as compost in 3 to 6 months, although it could be faster or slower depending on the size, the material you're using, the moisture, and oxygen. The U.S. Composting Council says to start your pile with a layer of brown carbon material, and it should be shredded or small pieces. This is going to help it break down faster. Then add your layer of nitrogen or green material on top, and you want to keep the ratio about 3 parts brown to 1 part green. And then add a small amount of soil on the top of this, and this is going to get some microbes into the pile, get it going. And then mix it a little with a pitchfork or a shovel and sprinkle it with water or spray it with a hose to dampen it. You want to keep adding to the pile in layers with the proper mix of brown and green material, and you can stage your yard and food waste in bins or buckets to keep that best ratio for good decomposition before you add it to the pile. You want to mix your pile once a week and check that the materials are damp, and build the pile to 3 foot by 3 foot and no more than 3 foot high, or 5 foot by 5 foot and 5 foot high. If you have a lot of waste, you can have multiple 3 foot by 3 foot piles. So if you have large gardens, landscape areas, or a yard where you're using this compost, you can have 3 piles. One that's finished to draw from, one that's full and it's breaking down, and then one pile that you're adding to every week. You can add redworms to your compost pile, and they're going to help it break down faster and add nutrients from their waste. A couple of top-rated sites online is Uncle Jim's Worm Farm, Buckeye Organics, and it's Buckeye, and Planet Natural, and they also have composting bins. And it's interesting, if you keep a compost pile working, the worms will live in the compost, but they don't go into the soil. Redworms don't really burrow into the soil like earthworms.
That's weird.
So some gardeners create a trench around 6 inches deep and wide all along the edge of the garden, and they fill it with compost for redworms to live in, and they're creating all these extra nutrients for the soil and plants. And then they add compost or yard and kitchen scraps to the top of this to keep it full of nutrients for the worms. When I spoke to the Burpee Seed Company, they said they recommend the Compost Wizard Tumbler, and they sell it on their website. They also have the Worm Factory 360. So this is a composter that uses redworms, and it has multiple sections that you can add, depending on how big you want this to be. So that's kind of cool, kind of modular. They also recommended the Garden Tower 2, and it's just Garden Tower and the number 2. If you want a container garden that you put food and scraps in the center of this, you add worms, and so it's creating fertilizer for the plants in this tower, and then it has a tray on the bottom where, as it decomposes all this material you put into it, you've got compost that you can pull out from the bottom. So
Exciting.
It's pretty cool. The Jobs Company, it's Jobes, has a compost starter that you can sprinkle over a new pile. So it has bacteria, it also has mycorrhiza, and this is a fungus that attaches to the plant's roots to help the plant absorb more water and nutrients. Pretty wild. It also has archaea, and these are microorganisms that work in low oxygen areas in your pile. They don't produce methane, and they work in a wide range of temperatures from 35 to 180 degrees Fahrenheit, and they break down compost faster than most microbes. So this is good for starting a new pile.
Exciting.
A drain spade or trenching shovel with a narrow blade works well for a small pile to cut through the yard and food waste and turn it over. True Temper, Fiskars, it's Fiskars, and Ames, AMES, all make top-rated shovels. The Root Assassin shovel is a garden shovel with serrated edges, and that helps you cut through compost material and break it up. For pitchforks, look for lightweight but solid pitchforks. You can try it out at the store. There's long handle and D-grip. See which one's more comfortable. Tines that are curved up will help you lift and turn the compost. Trooper, it's TRUPER, Radius Garden. Fiskars, Ames, and True Temper all have top-rated pitchforks.
Do you have anything else to add?
Composting is a great way to make use of kitchen and yard waste. It'll improve your soil, reduce the amount of fertilizer needed for your garden and landscape areas, and you can use it as a mulch. And if you don't want to become a composter, you can get some from the store.
Let's wrap this up.
You can subscribe to our podcast on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, CastBox, Himalaya, or your favorite podcast app.
If you enjoyed it, please leave us a review.
You can check out our home improvement videos on our YouTube channel, Fix It Home Improvement.
And you can subscribe to that as well.
You can download our books, Home Improvement Solutions, What Every Homeowner Should Know, on Amazon, book 1 through 6, soon book 7.
If you enjoyed it, please leave us a 5-star rating and review.
You can email us at fixitpodcast@gmail.com. You can follow Cindy on Twitter at FixItCohost, and you can check out our new Instagram, Fix It Home Improvement.
Thanks for listening.
Talk to you next week.